Hello, and welcome to the Red Bank Humanists podcast. Each month, Red Bank Humanists hosts a public forum featuring speakers and topics covering a wide range of subjects of special interest to the humanist community. To learn more, including information about our monthly book club and our Drinking Post-Theologically events, visit redbankhumanists.org and follow us on Twitter at Red Bank Humanists.
We do a lot of programs at the Red Bank Humanists that deal with Darwin, Darwinism, the theory of evolution. I just want to say a little bit about why we do this. We're particularly appreciative here at the Red Bank Humanists of the theory of evolution and risk sanctifying Darwin because before the publication of The Origin of Species, most people like us, educated, skeptical of religion, scientific in outlook, became deists. Would-be humanists in those days gave up on revealed religion, but still looked at the structure of the natural world and saw the work of a creator. After Darwin's alternate explanation for the complexity of life, we were able to confidently bid farewell to our creator. So, today's speaker on that very topic is Dr. Brian Regal. Dr. Regal teaches the history of science at Kean University here in New Jersey. His research focus is on the development of evolutionary theory and its relationship to politics, culture, and religion. His first book, the noted biography of Henry Fairfield Osborn, examined the early 20th century conflict over teaching evolution. We all remember like the Scopes monkey trial and all that, so if you are interested in that, a very good book to read. His Human Evolution, A Guide to the Debates, was profiled in an Air America radio interview with host Gene Garofalo. He also wrote the introduction to the autobiography of Charles Darwin. Note that he didn't write the autobiography, it was an autobiography, but he wrote the introduction. And he also wrote the introduction to a Darwin compendium published in 2006. He's the senior contributor to 2 volumes of Icons of Evolution, also recently published. His latest book, Searching for Sasquatch, subtitled Crackpots, Eggheads, and Cryptozoology, looks at the relationship between professional scientists and amateur naturalists in the field of monster hunting. And this has just been released in paperback. He's a fellow, Dr. Regal is a fellow of the Linnaean Society in London, and he's a fellow of the Kean University Center for History, Politics, and Policy. His latest project is a book which is a complete re-examination of the origins of the legend of the New Jersey Devil. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Brian Regal.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I want to talk a little bit about evolutionary biology in modern society. And unfortunately, you can't see the slide that well, but that's what it says up there, just in case. I do a lot of work on the history of science, and particularly how evolution impacts on society. I'm going to speak a bit about creationism and evolution. But before we do that, I want to get a few definitional issues out of the way. How science works, how science differs from metaphysics in its approach to the universe is sort of summed up here. We have materialism/naturalism, and there are 2 sort of subspecies of this approach. Methodological naturalism is where we try to explain the universe without any resource to metaphysics. And what that means is the way scientists do their work is to say, well, we're only going to try to explain things in a naturalist way, in a materialist way. There may be metaphysical forces out there, the methodological naturalist says, but we're not going to concern ourselves with them because science can't approach metaphysics, really. The other way, the slightly, as I tell students, a slightly angrier approach is the philosophical naturalist approach, which says basically the same thing as methodological naturalism, but they reject metaphysics out of hand. Whereas the methodological naturalists say that, well, there might be this, there might be that, there might be ghosts, whatever. Science really doesn't have the techniques, the methods to approach that, so we just ignore it. Whereas the philosophical naturalists just say there is no metaphysical, there is no spiritual life. What you see is what you get. The whole world is natural and materialist, and that's the way you explore this. And these two ideas are, in essence, at the heart of why so many religious people tend to hate science and history because of this approach. Now, a couple of examples or a couple of elements of pseudoscientific belief, which is where creationism falls in, just to kind of get you up to speed on some of this. There's something called confirmation bias. And that's where the believer in a position will accept only those facts which support their position. Then there's closely related is selective evidence compiling, where if 1,000 scientists tell you climate change is real, but you don't want to believe climate change is real, and one scientist says climate change isn't real, you go with that one rather than the 1,000. And so you pick and choose whoever is sort of supporting your position, that's who you will support. That's evidence selection. Then there's the backfire effect, which from my point of view is one of the most fun of all these. Because it says the more people tell you you're wrong, the more you know you're right. So if you think Bigfoot is real, and every environmental scientist in the country says, well, there really isn't any evidence for it, that immediately tells you you're the pioneer. You're right. All these egghead scientists, they're the ones who are wrong. And then knowledge source reversal. Again, I really enjoy this one because I run into this a lot. And any scholar, any scientist, any historian who does any kind of work in this field encounters this on a regular basis. The idea that the more formal education you have, the more training you have in a particular field, the more research you've done in that particular field, that's an indication of how wrong you are. It is the untrained amateur who is the true scientist. I did an op-ed for the Star Ledger a couple years back in 2012, if you recall all the kind of hurly-burly that was going on around 2012 in the Mayans. Everybody was very worried about the Mayans. And this occurred because of this very idea of knowledge source reversal. In the mid-1990s, there were a few people who began to read English translations of the Popol Vuh, which is the Mayan book of creation, and completely misunderstood what they read. The Mayans had this idea of life running in cycles, what they called baktuns. And each cycle is like 500 and, some odd years long. And at the end of that cycle, the world ends to be created anew. And people who didn't really understand this very kind of poetic, literary approach thought, oh my God, the Mayans have predicted the end of the world, and it's going to be in December of 2012. Now, Mayan scholars, genuine Mayan scholars, who had spent their careers studying Mayan culture, Mayan history, could read in the Mayan language, who did all the work you're supposed to do when you investigate one of these topics, knew that while, yes, the Mayans do say this, the meaning, however, is very poetic and was not meant to be taken literally. It's just like when we say, the end of the year is coming up, we say, well, another year is gone. The year is ending. The year is over. We don't believe the world is coming to an end. When January 1st of 2015 rolls around, the world's not going to, blow up. You take your Cats Be Crazy calendar, you throw it away, you hang up a new one, and we get on with our lives. And that's the way the Mayans saw it. Yes, this cycle is ending, but life will be rebuilt anew in a kind of literary way, not a literal way. And so Mayan scholars tried to tell people, this is not really what you think it is. You really don't need to get all worked up about it. And those sort of amateur end-of-the-world aficionados said, no, that's the establishment trying to fool you, man. They're covering up, man. And you get this a lot in pseudoscience and in science history and in the history of evolution and creationism. And just one last bit here before we go on to the fun stuff. One of the definitions, or some of the definitions of what pseudoscience is, it doesn't advance or ironically evolve. Astrology, for example, if you go to an astrologer today and have your horoscope read, the astrologer will be using essentially the exact same techniques that an astrologer would have used in the Middle Ages. It really hasn't advanced. Pseudoscience tends to be something which you can't prove or disprove. It has little testable evidence. Supporters are usually unwilling to accept contradictory evidence, and it's based upon primarily belief alone. One last thing, and that kind of relates to what we're doing here, as far as how science and metaphysics, or science and religion, relate to one another. If you ask any reputable scientist, they'll tell you, we don't deal with this because we don't have the tools to. Science weighs things, it measures, it takes a biopsy. And you can't really do that with metaphysical belief, with religious belief. If a believer says God is great, there really isn't much science has to say about that, because they can't determine one way or another whether God is great. But if you say that the world is only 6,000 years old, suddenly then science does have something to say about it, because science does have a pretty good grasp of how old the universe is, how it began, how old the Earth is, how life came to be on the planet. So in those ways, science can deal with it. And that's sort of brings us to what we're going to talk about tonight. And here's an example of evolutionary biology and modern society. This is an illustration from during the Renaissance, from the early modern period, showing what were called the monstrous races. Before people really knew about biological diversity, at least as far as humans were concerned, in Europe, this is a very Western tradition, they believed that there were all these sort of crazy human-like creatures running around. And this is kind of a compilation of them. All the way on the left, you have the Sciapodii, who had one giant foot. Next to them is the good old Cyclops with a single eye in the middle. Everyone's favorite, the two-headed baby. The Blemii, the people with no heads but a face in their chest. On the right, that looks like a werewolf, but it's actually cynocephaly, the dog-headed men. And they're different. These are two different traditions, werewolves and cynocephaly. According to the tradition, cynocephaly are people who are born this way. They're not supernatural creatures the way werewolves are. But my favorite aspect of this illustration, you might not be able to notice it unless you look close, is that it shows a little-known aspect of the history of clothing. Because you may not have known it, but the Speedo apparently was invented by the monstrous races, because they're all, that is just forward, cutting-edge wardrobe going on right there. And a lot of people don't know that. One of the earliest clashes, well, maybe clash is a bit overplaying it, but one of the first interesting points where evolution or transmutation, as it was called back then, and religion start to come into play is this is an illustration of Tyson's pygmy from 1699. Edward Tyson was a pioneering human anatomist, and he's the first Westerner to dissect a chimpanzee. Although now scholars think it may have been a bonobo, but that's not really important for our discussion here. And it's an important work. First editions of this go for hundreds of thousands of dollars. They're highly sought after by collectors. And what he did was he got one of these animals. He managed to get a hold of one in around 1667, 68. And he dissects it very carefully. And he has these incredibly detailed illustrations done of the animal's musculature and skeleton. And he also has this life reconstruction done. And it's probably the first really accurate depiction of a primate in the West, all except for the walking stick. Now, when Tyson writes his book, if you read the introduction to it, he says, one of the reasons why I'm doing this is because a lot of people think these monstrous races are real, that these monstrous creatures or human-like creatures are running around. I want to show you that these are biological creatures. They're not fake. They're not. They're these primates. And so he does this incredible book, but then has the illustration of the monkey walking around on a walking stick, which kind of muddle the message a little bit. Tyson is also sometimes held up as an early proponent of evolution. That's a bit in doubt. Scholars kind of argue this back and forth, whether he was really pushing for evolution. He certainly argued that human and primate anatomy were similar, but whether he took that final step to actually say that they were biologically related, he never really quite gets around to it. And here's the man of the hour, Charles Darwin. A number of myths about Darwin that most people, even supporters, understand. He does not invent evolution. The idea of transformation had been around all the way back to Aristotle. Plato, Pliny, a lot of these early Greco-Roman authors were asking questions about the transmutability of living things and whether they change from one form into another. And so there had been people, the Frenchman Lamarck was already putting forward, or had put forward decades before Darwin, the idea of the law of acquired characters, where things through effort, they change. If you haven't heard of Lamarck's name, you know his famous analogy about giraffes. The reason giraffes have long necks is because they start off with short necks, and then they stretch to reach the bushes and leaves. And in that active attempt to do this, they stretch their necks just a little bit. And each successive generation is then born with necks slightly longer, and next thing you know, you have giraffes with really long necks, which at the time sounded like a wonderfully elegant way to explain this. The only problem with Lamarck, as is often pointed out, is he's wrong. Personal effort upon the part of the individual really has no effect on evolution whatsoever. But the reason I bring this up is just to show that Darwin doesn't just sort of appear out of nowhere. There are a number of people in the West who are thinking about this, writing about it. Why Darwin is famous is not because he invents evolution, but he does something which nobody had quite done before, and that's come up with an explanation for how evolution works, how transmutation works. And he, of course, called it natural selection. And so the minute his book comes out in 1859, The Origin of Species, it's instantly controversial. His publisher, Murray, they only put out the first edition in about 1,200 copies because they didn't think anyone would read it. That's interesting today to think that even Darwin himself had no real hopes of this being a big seller. He just wanted the idea to get out. And so they said, well, we'll put out about 1,200 copies, and hopefully after a few years they'll have sold. And if you know anything about the story, you know that on the first day it's available, all 1,200 copies sell out. And they immediately start reprinting new ones. The first editions, again, like Tyson, Darwin's first edition of The Origin of Species is hugely valuable. Those original 1,200 copies, you can, if you want to have an original British edition of The Origin of Species, you can shell out about $1.5 million, and that'll get you one. So, If you have any ancient relatives who have like boxes of old books up in the attic somewhere, take a quick look. Because if they've got a first of the origin of species, you just hit the lottery. Now, around the time that the origin of species comes out, strange fossils are beginning to be found, initially in Germany. And of course, they're famously known as the Neanderthals, known because the first fossils were found in the Neander Valley in Germany outside Dusseldorf. And immediately these were controversial because some people said, well, these are obviously human ancestors, while others said, no, it can't be. There were some who said, well, the Neanderthal, because remember at the time they only found one of them. So as far as anyone was concerned, there was just an individual. And so they said, well, this is someone who had some sort of disease, and so they were deformed. Somebody said that, well, it was found in a region where Russian Cossack cavalry had been operating in one of the wars with Germany, and it must have been a wounded Russian Cossack who climbed into the cave to find a place to, get out of the rain and died, and then conveniently covered himself up with, material. They were seen as brutish because we now have hundreds of Neanderthal fossils. It wasn't just a single one. It was an entire species of human-related creatures. We know that they looked very much like us, but at the same time very different. And they were often portrayed, as in these two pictures, in very sort of negative terms. The illustration on the left is based on the work of Marcelin Boule, who wrote an early important book on human evolution and the Neanderthals. And ironically, it was a relative of his. This is a great trivia question, human evolution trivia question. His relative, who is named Henri Boule, wrote what famous novel, which spawned a whole series of movies? I'm sorry? Planet of the Apes, right. So there's a little, not quite sure why that gets applause, but there we are. So. And here's an old friend of mine, Bigfoot. This is the famous still from the Patterson film from 1967. A lot of people believe that this is real. And some creationists, what's really fascinating about this is that creationists have jumped on the Bigfoot bandwagon in support of it because they think that if Bigfoot is real, that somehow proves evolution doesn't work. Not quite sure why they think that. The delicious irony is that if Bigfoot is real, it only supports evolution. It's just yet another thing which, because if these things are real, which I don't think they are, but if they are real, they're obviously some kind of primate. And so they would be a fascinating example of bipedalism appearing outside of the human line. Here's yet another trivia question for you at the next party you're at. The only three kinds of living things in all the long history of life on Earth, only three of them have been true bipeds. Anybody know? One is the easy one. Humans, okay. Who else? Birds, not gorillas. Gorillas are not true bipeds. Kangaroos are secondary bipeds. Dinosaurs, not all of them, but the theropod, the bird-related dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus and those guys. They're the only one. There's three groups: humans, the theropod dinosaurs, and birds. The only creatures in the entire run of life on Earth to stand up on just two legs. Kangaroos use their tail when they sit, and they need their tail to balance. As far as we know, dinosaurs didn't do that. At least the two-legged dinosaurs didn't sit on their tail. They kept it up in the air just the way birds do. Oh, Loch Ness, of course. This is always a good one. This is the famous surgeon's photograph, known as the surgeon's photograph, which really created quite a stir when it came out in the 1930s. We now know that what you're looking at is not an actual living thing. It's a toy submarine, a wind-up toy submarine with a clay head attached to the top of it. That was, and they put it in the water and they took a picture, and oh my God, the Loch Ness Monster. This gets back to one of these questions that we started with about selective evidence and scholars versus amateurs. There are marine biologists and others who study Loch Ness on a regular basis. We know really quite a lot about its biological diversity. They know how big it is. They know what kind of animals live in it. They know a huge amount of information on the life on this lake. And no one has ever come across one of those. And trust me, I know a lot of scientists. They would love to think that's real. They would love to think Bigfoot is real. But they know better. Now, creationism. All cultures, as far back as there have been culture, organized cultures, have had some kind of creation story. No matter where you go in the world, God or the gods creates life on earth. So this is something which is very long-running in human experience. It's only in the mid-19th century that evolutionary or transmutational ideas start to come along. And so when The Origin of Species comes out in 1859, immediately people are fighting over it. There is the famous encounter at Oxford in 1860, where the British Association for the Advancement of Science, the very first public discussion of Darwin and his work. And the Archbishop Samuel Wilberforce is there. He's the Archbishop of Oxford, very well-known guy, very popular in the press a lot, incredible orator, knew how to get a crowd worked up. And they have this big meeting at the Museum of Natural History in Oxford, and it's sold out. People want to see. Everyone knows what's going to go on. Everyone wants to be there. Everyone wants to hear this discussion. And Wilberforce gets up, and for 2 hours, he's going on about how Darwin is wrong, and this is a horrible thing, and this turns men into monkeys, and horrible, horrible stuff. So we got to get rid of it. You shouldn't believe in it. In the front row are a number of naturalists. Darwin's not there. He didn't like public speaking. He didn't like public confrontation. He liked to stay home with his family, playing with his kids. But his good friend, Thomas Henry Huxley, goes for him. And he's sitting in the front row with a couple of other naturalists. And Wilberforce finishes, and the crowd is applauding. Yay, evolution's bad. Yeah. But Wilberforce cannot quite let it go. He can't just go out on a high note. He has to make one last dig, and he sees Huxley sitting in the front row. And he says, well, the eminent Professor Huxley is here today with us, and I would like to ask him one question. Does your grandmother descend from a monkey, or did you descend from a monkey on your grandmother's side or your grandfather's side? And the place goes crazy, applauding, hats. Huxley doesn't say a thing. He just sits there, lets the din die down, stands up, straightens his vest, fixes his tie, and he says, I would rather be related to a monkey than to a man like you, who would use your gifts and your intellect and your position and your power to disparage someone for simply trying to find out about how the universe works. And the place goes wild a second time, this time in favor of Huxley. And so this is often pointed at as the first sort of public beginning of the battle between science and religion over human evolution. And it will go on like that quite a bit. In America, it doesn't really take off just yet. That doesn't really happen until the early 20th century. That's in part because evolutionary thinking, aside from being taught in a few colleges and universities, is not really taught in the school system yet. What happens is by the end of the 19th into the early 20th century, public schools start using a series of biology textbooks that are written by sort of the generation that grows up with Darwinian thinking. And so they start putting this into textbooks. And this is what starts to get people very crazy, because that kind of runs into, it's one of those moments where the cosmic wheels turn in just the right fashion, that evolution starts being taught in the public school system right around the time of the rise of Christian fundamentalism, with a publication of a series of books called The Fundamentals on the Fundamentals of Christianity, which is where the term fundamentalist Christian comes from. And they start deciding all the kind of conflict that's going on in our political system right now. The effort by in some quarters to push religious thinking, particularly Christian thinking, into the government, into political thought, the idea of eliminating public education because it's somehow the work of the devil. This is the point at which this all starts. 1910, 1915, like right before the First World War. And this is where you start to get people arguing that this stuff shouldn't be taught in schools, and this conflict begins to arise. And the problem is, from a creationist point of view, is we had that pesky Constitution, where you might want to argue that everyone should have a machine gun, and that the Constitution says that, but you also have to deal with the whole separation of church and state and not teaching religious ideas in the public school system. And so what they tried to do was get around it another way, which I think is really the most fascinating aspect of creationism, is how they try to get around it by not using religious, but by using supposedly scientific approach, which comes down to it being pseudoscience. They'll say, well, evolution doesn't work because we have the scientific evidence to prove it doesn't. Generally speaking, most scientists will tell you that it takes about 15,000 years to fossilize something, give or take. The chances of something being fossilized are extremely against the odds. For every one fossil you can buy in a museum gift shop, there are thousands of individual creatures that don't get fossilized. You're really sort of beating the odds for something to be fossilized. That's how difficult it is. But it takes about 15,000 years. And so one of the ways creationists have attacked this is, first off, they say, well, fossils are fake. They're all just fake. So you can't trust them. You can't believe them. And the other thing they do at the same time is fake their own fossils. And here's one of my favorites. This is the limestone cowboy boot from the song. Rhinestone cowboy, limestone cowboy. And this was very popular, not quite as much today, but for a while it was extremely popular. It was claimed to be, as you can see, it's a cowboy boot, obviously a modern cowboy boot, with a fossilized human leg still inside of it. And depending upon which creationist group was using this, they would say, well, this proves evolution is fake because obviously there were no cowboy boots 15,000 years ago, so how could you have a fossilized human foot inside a modern cowboy boot unless it takes a much shorter period of time for something to fossilize, maybe a decade rather than 15,000 years. Therefore, any of these fossils they show you must be fake, or they're new, therefore the Earth really isn't very old, it's very young, and therefore we win and science is wrong. The problem is, first off, this is not actually a fossil. There is a process known as calcification, which can mimic a fossil, but it's not an actual fossil. And calcification can happen in just a relatively few years if the geographical conditions are just right. And secondly, that's not a human leg. It's a cow leg that had calcified naturally and was shoved into an old cowboy boot to try to prove that evolution is wrong. It's so preposterous that even some creationists don't even talk about it anymore. Here's another couple of fun ones. The one on the left, that's the clock in the rock. A supposed modern mechanical clock fossilized inside a stone. How could that happen if fossils take so long to be made? There's the hammer in the rock. Again, how could fossilization take so long if you can get again, both of these are fake. The rock is in a piece of calcified stone, which can happen relatively rapidly. And so one of the ways that creationists use is to first off say fossils are fake, and then fake their own fossils and say, well, if these are real, you explain this. That's a popular creationist thing to do. Explain that, explain that. I actually don't have to explain anything. They have to explain it. And so these are some of the more popular examples of how that's done. Here's one of my favorites. This is, you can see the big three-toed theropod footprint there on the right, and then a human footprint right next to it. How could that be if humans and dinosaurs didn't live together? Making dinosaurs very new. Either way, these are set up in the way that no matter what way you try to talk your way out of it, you still get trapped because, well, if that means that humans live with dinosaurs, or dinosaurs must be really new because humans are new, and there's These came out of this. This is the Biloxi River in Texas. This is a genuine fossil site, very famous. It was discovered in the 1930s by a field naturalist for the Museum of Natural History, Rollin T. Bird, who had heard about this from locals. He was traveling around looking for fossils for the museum, and there were people who said, oh, there's down by the river, there's tons of these dinosaur tracks. You should go see them. So we went down to see them, and it's a huge treasure trove of dozens and dozens of dinosaur footprints. At one time, the Gulf of Mexico extended all the way up, almost into Canada. And when it drained off, that's why the plain states are the plain states, because they were once the bottom of an ocean. That's why wheat grows out there really well, because of all that sediment in there. And Texas was part of that. And so they've had these really important trackways there of different dinosaurs. And because this was a mud flat originally, and if you've ever been down the shore by the Raritan River, when the tide goes down, there's all that muck along the side of the river. And if you walk in it, it's squishy, and birds run by, they leave little tracks. It's really quite cool. If you ever see that, you're seeing the very same process by which tracks like this were created. But you have some of the larger ones are from a large theropod, not a Tyrannosaurus, but a smaller cousin to the Tyrannosaur. Still an animal that probably ran 1-2 tons on 2 legs with very sharp claws, and running around in the mud. And if you've ever tried to run around in the mud, you slide quite a bit. So imagine a 2-ton dinosaur sliding around in a mud flat. So they're not always going to leave these perfect 3-toed prints. They're going to be squashed, they're going to be deformed just as any animal would, just as a human would when you walk around in mud. And because you can see all different kinds of tracks. So this was a very popular place where animals were running around. So some tracks going this way, some tracks going that way, some tracks are on top of one another. And a few of them, because of this sliding in the mud kind of thing, you have a 2-ton animal squashing through a foot-deep layer of soft mud, give off a kind of human appearance. But it's only because of the way the mud caused the animal to slide around. And creationists saw these and said, aha! Here is scientific evidence that humans and dinosaurs were together. It's a fossil. You scientists, you're the one who's always talking about fossils. Here's some fossils for you. Explain that one. Clearly, the Earth isn't as old as you think it is. Clearly, there's no such thing as evolution. Clearly, humans and dinosaurs are running around at the same time. Therefore, na-na-na-na-na. And so this is the kind of thing that we run into. This attempt to use science to prove their religious point of view. And that's interesting because it's an acknowledgement, it's a tacit acknowledgement that science is the way you know things. We want to prove God is real. We want to prove humans and dinosaurs were running around at the same time. We want to prove the Earth is very young rather than very old. How are we going to do that? The only way we have to do that is through science. So they use the very thing that they don't like to prove the thing they do like in order to disprove the thing they don't like. Several years ago at Kean, it was like the second year I was there, walking across campus, and I see this poster on the wall. Come to a religion versus evolution debate. And I thought, well, I have to go to that. And it was sponsored by the Campus Christian Student Union, whatever. I'm not sure what they call it. They're actually very nice kids. I don't mean to make fun of them. But it was late, and I was like, it didn't start till like 8:30, you know. So I said, well, but I should go. You know, I should not go. I should at least go and sit and see what happens. So I go in, and they're having it in the one of the science lecture rooms, the amphitheater with the chairs going up, the levels going up, you know, so you can look down. And my plan was I would quietly sneak into the back and just sit and just watch and listen, you know. I wasn't there for a fight. I go in, and there are two presenters who I think were from Answers in Genesis, a group that you might be familiar with. They're the guys who built the Creation Museum out there in Cincinnati. Or was it Cleveland? Kentucky. Out there somewhere. I don't know for sure, but they had some of their slides, the graphics on the slides reminded me of, either they were just, you know, copying Answers in Genesis slides, or they may have been from that group. I'm not sure. There were 3 people in the crowd, and I was one of the 3. And the other 2 were the 2 students from the Christian organization who had put the whole thing together. So I couldn't just slip in quietly like I wanted to. I had to kind of, you know. And the amphitheater is designed in such a way that when you walk through the door, you're immediately in the front of the room. So as soon as I walk in, bam, there's these 2 guys are sitting right there. So there was no sneaking in quietly. But I go in and I sit down. And they're talking and they're showing slides. And I said, you know, I'm not here for a fight. I just want to watch, that's all. And time's going by, and they're talking about this, talking about that, and they start saying some things which I know are just factually incorrect, but I keep my mouth shut. Until finally it just built up to such a point where I had to say something. And so I actually put my hand up. I'm in a room with 5 people. I put 2 of whom are the presenters, and I put my hand up. And I said, well, what about this? Well, we don't really know that. Well, actually, we do. We do know how carbon dating works. The decay of atoms. They don't really know that. Yes, they do. Well, and I guess the guy had given these talks before, and I think he was used to an audience that didn't know anything. Now, I'm not a scientist, I'm a historian. So at one point I said, well, you know, we have an incredibly good geology department here. I can go grab someone and have him come down and explain radiometric dating to you if you want, from a scientist. So then he starts grilling me with questions. You know, well, what about this? What about that? I said, well, and I could just see he was... He said, well, let me show you some slides. And he starts showing me slides. And he shows me a slide of a pterodactyl. Now, Eric mentioned before, my very first book, which was my doctoral dissertation, was on the life of Henry Fairfield Osborn, famous scientist in the early part of the 20th century. Second only in public fame to Einstein. Nobody remembers him now, but back then he was in all the papers. He ran the Museum of Natural History in New York. Very famous guy, always commenting publicly on everything. And he was hooked up with an artist named Charles R. Knight. If you ever read a science textbook that was published between, say, the 1950s and the 1970s, you saw paintings by Charles R. Knight. He did cavemen, dinosaurs, extinct mammals. The name may not be familiar to it, but if I showed you pictures, you'd recognize. Famous artist. But this picture of a pterodactyl was one of Charles R. Knight's paintings of a pterodactyl, an animal which had gone extinct many millions of years ago. And the guy says to me, well, what's this? I said, well, it's a painting of a pterodactyl. No, it's not. It's a photograph of the thunderbird. I said, no, it's a painting of a pterodactyl by Charles R. Knight. Well, what's this one? And he shows me a picture of kind of like a dinosaur-y looking thing kind of stomping around the jungle. And as soon as he showed it, I knew what he was going for. And sort of the darker part of my character, which I usually try to keep under control, came out a little bit, because now I felt obliged to, grapple. And I said, that is Makili Mbembe. And he looked at me like he would have bet money that I didn't know that. For those of you who don't know, Makili Mbembe is a famous African legend about a supposedly surviving dinosaur, that even into the 20th century, there were still dinosaurs running around parts of Central Africa, eating villagers, And he said, yeah, well, that's a live dinosaur. How can a live... I said, it's not. It's a legend. There are no live dinosaurs running around. And then I said, well, that's not exactly true. Oh, you see, even you admit. I said, yes, there are dinosaurs still running around, flying around. They're called birds. And he just getting more and more upset. And I said, look, dude, I'm not here to fight with you. I just wanted to watch from behind. This is your show. I got to go. Family Guy's coming on soon, and I don't want to, they're still showing new episodes. I didn't want to miss that. And so I left. And a couple days later, just by accident, I ran into the kid who was the president of the Christian Association, the Student Christian Association, in the cafeteria. And I said, I want to apologize. I didn't mean to wreck your meeting, And he said, no, that was great. I wish we wanted you to stay. Would you talk to our group again about all of this? So I inadvertently undermined, that this kid's probably an atheist now. And I sowed the seeds of doubt in this poor kid's mind, but this is the not that. This is where the world of creationism and its attacks on science are. The other thing I find really fascinating is that a lot of anti-science, anti-evolution people will attack Darwin personally. Well, he was a racist, and he was a misogynist, and he was this, and he was that. None of which is actually correct. There's a terrific book came out a couple years ago called Darwin's Sacred Cause by Jim Moore, where they examine how Darwin was an abolitionist, and they argue that, well, while Darwin's in South America on the Beagle voyage, he sees slave markets, and he's repulsed by it, and he's sickened by it, and they argue, part of the reason why he develops the idea of transmutation is to show that all living things are connected. Therefore, human beings, they might have superficial differences, but they're all the same, and so that undercuts the idea of slavery, which some Christians and even some scientists were saying, well, it's people of color are biologically different, therefore that's all the justification you need to enslave them. And so they argue that Darwin, in his reaction against this, that's part of the reason why he wrote The Origin of Species. But even if Darwin was sort of a rabid racist, it doesn't matter. it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter who I am, it doesn't matter how I behave. If I take this object and I throw it across the room, it's going to fall due to gravity. It doesn't matter what kind of person I am. So it doesn't matter what kind of person Darwin was, evolution is still an operating principle on our planet, regardless of who thought up the idea. And speaking of gravity, Isaac Newton was not a great guy. Brilliant, but of a bit of an ass. Not a very nice person. Didn't treat people around him very nice. Was kind of self-centered. Would have today passed for a Christian fundamentalist. Speaking about the end of the world, Newton actually predicts the end of the world. It'll be 2065. He did these extensive calculations based upon biblical texts, and he calculated that the world would end in 2065. He thought gravity was a divine invention. So to attack Darwin, if you ever hear anyone use the term Darwinist, that is a little siren should go off in your head. This is an anti-science person. Because evolutionary biologists don't call themselves Darwinists. They call themselves evolutionary biologists. Because what Darwin knew compared to what we know today about evolution is very different. He didn't know anything about genetics. He didn't know, a lot of things about how cells worked. And so the knowledge we have of Darwin or of evolution today is far in advance of what Darwin knew. He would be, I think, really quite tickled at how much we know now over what he knew then. It's just like astronomers. Astronomers hold Copernicus in high esteem. Well, Copernicus said the Earth goes around the sun, not the sun around the Earth, but Copernicus thought the sun was at the center of the universe. We now know that's not the case. It's only the center of our solar system. And so what we know about the movement of the heavens now is far in excess of what Copernicus understood back then. But astronomers don't call themselves Copernicans. They call themselves astronomers. So while evolutionary biologists, historians of science hold Darwin in high esteem, he's not held up as, this kind of divine-like figure. He's a guy who came up with an idea that was pretty close to how things actually work, and that's why we hold him in that position. We now have Darwin Day. And this is going to sound kind of odd, but I'm not so sure if I'm for Darwin Day. And the reason is because if we do that, if we say, here's a day we will celebrate Darwin, the word celebration will eventually become worship. And that's not what we do. We don't worship Darwin. We respect him. We hold his work in high esteem. And so I'm not really sure if Darwin Day is such a great idea for that reason. And so what we have to do is we have to keep in mind a group like this, which I think is really terrific. We have to keep in mind these concepts of what pseudoscience is, how they're different, how they work, and keep fighting to promote reality rather than unreality. Now more than ever, we have a system which is supporting all sorts of weird things. And it used to be just sort of crazy people way out on the fringes said stuff like, well, a woman can't really be raped or get pregnant from being raped because the female body has special mechanisms in it which turns off. So, something like that used to be said by people way out on the edges. Now it's being said by elected officials on the floors of Congress. And climate denial and anti-vaccination and all this stuff and anti-evolution and anti-science in general. You have to fight against it. You can't ever really give up because they never give up either. And if I may end with the shameless self-promotion part of the talk, this is my book that just came out in paperback, Searching for Sasquatch, Crackpots, Eggheads, and Cryptozoology. It's not about proving Bigfoot is real. I'm not interested in that. I don't think it is, but that's not the point. I look at this relationship between professional scientists and amateurs and how they go about doing things. And let me just say, because I've kind of knocked amateurs a bit, I'm not anti-amateur. I'm pro-amateur. Darwin was essentially an amateur. He was not a professional scientist by any means. Many of the most important scientific discoveries and historical discoveries we have were done by amateurs. We have to be careful, however, of people who don't know what they're talking about making decisions. This is a free country where you're allowed to say whatever you want. That's fine. But we have to be careful that when people say outrageous stuff, that we can come back and counter that. And the absolute last bit of the shameless self-promotion part of the morning, I teach at Kean University in the Department of History, which I think is the best one in the region. Princeton has a bit of an edge on us because they have a better library than we do. But we have a terrific department. If you know anyone who's interested in going to university and studying history, we have a fantastic department. And those of you who are interested in doing such a thing, our department does take donations. If you give us enough money, we'll name something after you. We have a department webpage. Just Google Kean History and it pops right up. And we have a little donations thing. So if in case you feel so inclined. And so I would like to thank the Red Bank Humanists for having me here today, and thank you for coming to listen to me ramble on about this crazy stuff. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Regal. So we do have time for a bit of question and answer with Dr. Regal. Stephen is going to be running the mic around, our immediate past president. And I just want to remind you that not only does this mic he carries serve as amplification, but it also serves as permission to talk. It is the talking stick, so we'll have one person at a time. Please raise your hand, and you will be found.
Yeah, how have the creationists responded to the discovery of the Tiktaalik by Neil Shubin and his group? Because they kept saying, oh, there's a missing link. We're not descendant from fish.
Right.
Now we have the missing link. How have they responded to that?
Two ways. The first one, it's not what scientists think it is. It's a modern animal. Secondly, it's fake. Oh, yeah, a couple of years ago there was a fossil called Tiktaalik, which is a kind of fishy, leggy fish, which shows that there was a point at which fish-like creatures, because they had evolved appendages strong enough to do so, came out of the water and actually walked around, probably for brief periods, but could walk around outside of their water environment before going back in. And so that's, again, the scientists don't really use the term missing link, because it's a bit misleading. Really, again, like the term Darwinist, the only people who use the term missing link are creationists. Everything is a link. Every animal alive today, we are linked between what came before and what will hopefully come after. So every living thing, there are no animals or plant life on Earth which has reached a dead end and stopped. And this is what it's always going to be. It will always evolve into something else. So all living things are in that way a link. But the term missing link is a kind of bit Victorian romanticism, which is a lot of fun, but not really accurate scientifically. Yes?
Okay, I'd like to go back to something you said early on, and that was every culture has some type of a creation.
Right.
Everyone does. In their way of explaining the unexplainable until science comes along. But what is your opinion of what some people are calling the God gene? That the human, part of the human element is the ability to believe in mythology, that every culture has this. and as a reliance upon this.
Right. Well, I'm not a geneticist, so I can't speak to it at that level. However, as a historian, I would argue that all evolutionary adaptation is a way of dealing with the environment. That's how evolution works. It's not survival of the fittest. It's survival of the best adapted. And so that's why there is such a huge diversity of life on Earth, because it's all examples of different ways different species and different populations try to adapt to their environment to survive. And I think the mythology thing comes from because our line developed these much bigger brains, greater cognitive ability. If you are an early human ancestor and you are running around the woods, living in a cave, whatever environment you're in, it must have been incredibly scary. And it must have been incredibly anxiety-provoking because everything was bigger than you. Everything could eat you. Everything was stronger than you. Everything was faster than you. And so I think ideas of religion and mythology are an evolutionary adaptation, because you can either sit there and shiver in the dark and say, oh my God, if I take a step, something's going to eat me, or because you have this brain which can do this, you begin to work out ideas about the past, about the future, about unseen deities which are on your side. And so in a world where everything can eat you, everything else is stronger, everything else has bigger teeth, everything else looks at you as dinner, if you can develop these sort of mythological, legendary ideas about a deity or deities which are invisible but are looking after you, I would imagine that would take some of the anxiety out of it. So, again, I'm not a geneticist. Don't take this as the final word on evolutionary cognition. But I would think that that all of that is an evolutionary adaptation to living in a world where you're alone, as alone can be. Did that answer your question at all? Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
I have two questions, but I'll just pick one. Since Darwin is not responsible for the entire theory of evolution, would it be correct?
Well, he's responsible for natural selection.
That was my question.
Right.
Natural selection and or survival of the fittest or adaptation.
A term which Darwin never uses.
Okay. But was there something along that line that he does use? So, if we're talking about Darwin, then what is the most accurate thing to say about his contribution, his main contribution?
That he comes up with the answer to the question of if evolution is an operating biological principle, what's the explanation? How does it work? And that's what Darwin comes up with. Basically what natural selection argues, and this is going to be the 30-second version, that there are basically sort of three things going on. There is hereditary change to a population's genetics, which occur for a number of reasons, including being out in the sun. That actually mixes up your genetic material in your reproductive organs. And environmental change and pressure from survival. Who gets the food, who doesn't get the food. And it's these three things working in this incredibly complex interplay that forces things to adapt to their environment. Part of the reason that animals look so different, plants, for example, and insects, I mean, there are crazy-looking insects out there. And you look at them, why does it have this thing sticking out of its head? Why does it have this? Why do orchids, we look at orchids and say, oh, they're so beautiful. They're kind of weird looking. Why are orchids have this strange shape? And it's because these are all parts that are being added on as time goes by. One of the big and most foolish of the creationist arguments is they say, well, why isn't there half a duck and half an alligator? Why don't you see animals that are clearly half of one thing and half of another? Show me something like that, and then I'll believe in evolution. the problem, first of all, that shows that they have no understanding of how evolution works. But secondly, the reason why animals look the way they do and plants is because in their attempts to adapt to an environment, they're constantly adding parts on. And so one of the favorite creations, especially of intelligent design people, they throw the mousetrap at you. They say, well, look, here's a mousetrap designed by human beings to catch mice. If you take any piece of the mousetrap out, it can no longer trap mice. Therefore, what good is it? What about the human eye? You take any piece away from the human eye, we can't see. Why would living things have gone for millions of years with an eye that doesn't actually see, waiting for it to see? And again, that's a complete misunderstanding of how evolution works. The eye doesn't spring into being as a human eyeball. It starts off very differently, and it did different things. And as time goes by, as the environment changed, as the selection pressures changed, the plants, the animals, had to find new ways of doing what they did in order to survive, and that would usually mean adding some new parts on, so that they could survive in that situation. With the mousetrap, the way you answer, if someone hits you with the mousetrap analogy, say, well, if you pull the spring off, and so the mousetrap doesn't catch mice anymore, what good is the mousetrap? Well, the good of it is that before it caught mice, before it added the spring, the mousetrap did something else. It performed some other function. Maybe exactly. It starts off as a cheese board. You put a spring on it. Now it can catch mice. And you can still, and don't try this at home, you can use a rat trap as a cheese board. When I found that out in the service when we were out in the field a really long time. You could take it. But that's how it works. So the thing does one thing, and then if selection pressures, climatic change, environmental change, it either goes extinct because it can't adapt, or it adapts in some way, and that's usually by taking on some other function.
I want to ask you a question. I guess this is more in your area of history.
Mm-hmm.
There seems to be almost a schizophrenic situation of science in the United States in the early 20th century has had such an impact on us that we are leaders in technology, or have been, and yet there is this big reaction against what's really pushing the whole country in a way forward. So could you comment on why that is and is so strong right now?
It would probably take me all day to really answer that question, but what I hope is a coherent short answer is, politically, since the 80s, I would say, up until then, you have the Republican Party, you have the Democratic Party battling over various things. And there were ideologies on both sides, And you could argue, progressives and conservatives could argue back and forth about, well, how much money should we spend here? Should we go to war there? What should we do about the health of the nation? These sort of important issues. And they would disagree a lot. And there were radicals and people out of control on both sides. But what I found is that the Republican Party of today seems very different from that one. My father was a Republican, big Nixon supporter, until he thought his son might have to go fight in Vietnam, then not so much. But it seems to me now, certainly those in public view aren't just arguing points of policy, which is what you're supposed to do. They're arguing against facts. I'm waiting for one of these right-wing political commentators to come out and say, daylight is a liberal conspiracy. There's really no such thing as daylight. People don't really die. That's just socialists telling you that. That's what I find puzzling, frightening. What are they going to say next? 1 + 1 is not 2. Mathematics is just a liberal plot. And you didn't really see that sort of thing before. It would be very strange. Some of you a little older might recognize this sort of thing, but in the past, some of the, sort of the conservative end of our political spectrum, they always tended to promote the wealthy. And we all sort of expected that. But they used to say, well, we should have a solid public education system because that makes the economy go better. We should support small business because that makes the economy run better. We should promote science and medicine and mathematics because that makes the economy run better. And okay, yeah, the rich get rich, but everybody else does too. Working people get a chance. The middle class gets a chance. And the rich get even wealthier, but it's all good for the whole society. Now they seem to be attacking those ideas. Public education is, one step above devil worship. There is no climate change. There is no evolution. I mean, that's why I said, I don't want to say jokingly because every time you think, well, it can't get any dumber than this, something comes along even worse. And so that's the thing that kind of really worries me. It's not just a disagreement on policy. I tend to come from the more progressive, liberal side, but having said that, you do need conservative thinking in a functioning democracy. You have to have people on this side and people on that side, the two forces working against each other. You wind up with the best of both worlds. Now the one side has gone so far to the right, it's like they're living in a different time-space continuum. And I can't really, I think the attempt to inject more religion into the situation is a big cause of it, but I'm not really sure what. It's something I think is beyond my ability to explain in 30 seconds.
Thank you for trying.
Yeah,
That's my job.
That was going to be my question as to why we are still fighting these battles, but we don't know. We've got a few more minutes. There's lots of questions. If everyone could just be patient and hang in there until the very end, that would be great.
I have a related question to the last one. I wonder what changes you've seen in your students over the years in terms of belief in pseudoscience. And from your knowledge of history, do you think our society as a whole is really sort of, like the ancient Roman thing, like we're past our prime and
Right.
we're heading downhill? Or is this just kind of a freaky part of our history and we're just transitioning to some more indifferent and maybe more enlightened society?
Right. Well, the easily scared part of me wants to say, "Oh my God," and climb under the bed but the one of the things that keeps me from thinking all is lost are my students. They are reacting to a lot of the stuff going on now in the way that makes me feel like maybe we're not all doomed. They see a lot of this, what's going on as foolishness. They're reacting against it because if 1 + 1 = 2 and someone tells you it's 3, you question whether this person knows what they're talking about. And a lot of my students, and I'm sure they're a microcosm of the whole, this young generation, that they are looking in a fairly progressive way. That makes me think that all is not lost. That they see the foolishness of some of this thinking and want to get back to a place where people do have compassion for their neighbor, where people are interested not just in getting wealthy, but not in screwing the person who isn't wealthy. And so it gives me a lot of hope. Everything ends sooner or later. Evolution is about change. I don't have a problem with our society changing. I think it is changing. I think the sort of dark, what I see as a dark period right now is a way of forcing people back towards the light. In medical parlance, there's something called a catharsis, where things medically, you get so ill, and then suddenly, because the illness becomes so intense, you sort of snap out of it. The fever breaks, that kind of thing. And the hopeful side of me says that as bad as all the stuff is, this will force people to say, wait a minute, climate change is not political. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what color your skin. It doesn't matter what religion you follow or not follow. It doesn't matter whether you're on the right-hand side of the spectrum or the left, or whether you're conservative or a liberal. It's climate change. The climate doesn't care what your political affiliation is. If it's going to destroy you, it's going to destroy you. And in the end, who cares what the cause is? The climate is changing. Whether you want it to or not, let's do something. Or at least try. It doesn't matter whether you like it or not. Evolution is an operating principle in the well, at least on this planet, is an operating principle in the biological life of the Earth. It's not a Republican or a Democratic thing. Sandy didn't care what your political affiliation was. If it washed your town away, it didn't care whether you supported the governor or supported the president. It washed your town away. Your basement flooded not because you were a Republican or a Democrat, because it rained a lot. That's why. And I'm hoping that that will be the positive outcome, that this will force people to say, okay, we've had our fun. We got crazy for a little while. Let's try to get the train back onto, the track to Normalville, or at least somewhat saneville. So who knows?
Thank you for coming. Other than evolution, what other ideas from science had the biggest effect on society, do you think?
Gravity, genetics, atomic theory. One of the things that really gives me a smile about the creationists is that they're wasting their time for so many reasons. They're wasting their time because evolution's there. It doesn't matter whether you think it's there or not. It's there. But secondly, evolution really doesn't affect us the way you think. Evolution is about change. And things are going to change whether you want them to or not. But evolution only deals with where species come from and what they change in and out of. If you're really worried about science undermining our notion of reality, quantum mechanics is the thing you really want to worry about. Because in its most extreme forms, quantum mechanics questions the very nature of reality. If you don't know where an atom is, if you don't know where the protons of an atom are, how do you know where the atom is? If you don't know where the atom is, how do you know where anything is? 98% of everything we think of as matter is empty space. We are all mostly empty space. And the reason why, if I do that, the reason why my hand doesn't go through the wall, despite the fact that my hand is mostly empty space and the wall is mostly empty space, is because the atoms move in such a crazy, uncontrollable manner that they form the illusion of solidity. But we're still not sure where those atoms are. And so if you wanted to undermine, if I wanted to get into your head about whether you're here or not, I can do to you what I do to my students sometimes. I say, prove to me you're real. Prove to me you're here. Prove to me you are where you think you are. Am I a figment of your imagination? Are you a figment of my imagination? And if you think about it, it can really put the whammy jammy on your head. And creationists just, whatever. They're so fixated on evolution that they miss the idea, which is really undermining everything they hold sacred. If we don't know where an atom is, how many atoms are in God? Where is God located? How do the protons behave which make up God? And the nasty, sarcastic side of me says, well, they don't care about physics because they don't understand physics. Evolution is relatively easy to understand and, of course, misunderstand. Physics is a bit tougher. Although there are a few creationists who sort of dabble in the physical aspect, and they love to talk about thermodynamics and Lord Kelvin. They love to throw names. Lord Kelvin, who was a British scientist around the time that Darwin is alive, who works out some of the laws of explaining thermodynamics. And they say, well, thermodynamics says the Earth only has so much heat in it. And if the Earth was billions of years old, it would be an ice ball by now because all the heat would be gone. Completely missing the fact that the reason why the Earth is still warm is because at the core is essentially a huge atom bomb that is constantly exploding and giving off heat, and will continue to explode for a very long time. But it always gives me a chuckle to see them avoid physics and go after evolution as a way of undermining science.
All right, just 2 more questions. This is great. There's been a lot of questions.
I just wanted to speak to the question about imagination that you sort of raised before. The evolutionary biologists and cognitive theorists consider that imagination actually is an evolutionary development, and that it was a very practical evolutionary development. And it's not so much that people are just searching for answers to, why does it rain on us or why does our house catch on fire, but that the ability to ask those kinds of questions come out of a whole series of developments that made it possible for human beings to be differentiated between humans and other animals by the ability to do forward thinking, to have intentionality, and to think about the future, which is something different than other animals do, and that's where that kind of thinking comes out of just serendipitously. Yeah.
One last question. Okay.
Darwin was influenced by other people, and I think the name is Wallace.
Yes, Alfred Russel Wallace.
Could you say something about the relationship between Darwin and Wallace? Specifically, did Darwin get all the credit?
Okay. Alfred Russel Wallace was a naturalist. This is one of the great examples of coincidence in the history of science. Wallace was a young guy, Englishman, working in Sumatra in Malaysia as a collector. He made a living by going around Asia and collecting up plants and animals to sell to rich collectors back in England. And he was doing this for years, and he's a very smart guy. And he comes up basically with natural selection from direct observation. And Darwin, because of the Beagle voyage, was already fairly well known. I mean, it's not like he sort of bursts upon the scene just with the origin of species. He was already a well-known naturalist before that because of the earlier books he had written. And Wallace writes a letter to him in 1856 or 7, something like that. And he says, "Oh, Mr. Darwin, we met once before in London, and I have this idea." And keep in mind that Darwin hasn't really told many people about it. He's kept this relatively quiet. One of the other myths is that Darwin kept it secret. He doesn't exactly keep it secret. He just doesn't really broadcast it much. He shows Huxley. He shows some others. But Wallace had no idea of that. And he writes this letter. And Darwin opens it up and he reads it and he can't believe it. He's like, because here's his idea. Almost exactly, Wallace doesn't use the term natural selection, but as close as you could get without using the term. And Darwin doesn't know what to do. He says, do I throw this letter in the fire? Do I act like I never knew the guy? What do I do? What do I do? He tells Huxley. Huxley says, practically grabs him by the collar and says, dude, publish your book already. And in the end, to Darwin's credit, he says, I can't screw this guy over. And so they decide to publish joint papers and have them read at the Linnaean Society. Neither one of them are going to be there because Wallace is in Sumatra, Darwin doesn't do these kind of things, and so they have other people read them at a meeting of the Linnaean Society. And incredibly, this is such a great story, the papers get read. If you've ever been to a conference, nobody wants to give the paper late in the day or on the Sunday, because they know by Sunday afternoon, everybody who counts is already flying home because they got to go back to work on Monday. And so because of some mix-ups, the two papers don't get read until late in the day when the crowd is just a sprinkling of people. And the two readers get up there and they say, okay, and this is a paper from Mr. Darwin, and reads the paper. And now here's the paper from Mr. Russell, and it just goes over everybody's head. Nobody really knows. Oh, great, can we go get dinner now? I got a train to catch. I got to be. And so it doesn't really, nobody really reacts to it. And so Darwin was like, I'm off the hook. He immediately publishes The Origin of Species, which causes the huge, And there are those now who say, well, Darwin screwed Wallace around, and Darwin was a bad guy because he and stole Wallace's idea, which we now know is ridiculous. What happens is, so the question then becomes, well, why isn't Wallace as famous as Darwin? And Wallace certainly is famous within the world of the history of science, but average people, they don't. You say Darwin, they sort of have an idea. Wallace, who? Part of the reason why Wallace doesn't really achieve that kind of stature is because he's got an intellectual problem. Wallace, he believes in God. Darwin is losing interest, let's say, and not for the reasons you think. What Wallace ends up doing is saying, okay, all life evolves, all life came about naturally. However, the human spirit, the human soul, that's put in by God. And that's how Wallace and a lot of people sort of got around evolution, because there were a lot of people who were, even on the religious side, who wanted to, because Darwin had made such a good argument, said, okay, yeah, but there's that last bit. Where do we fit God in? And so people like Wallace and others said, okay, well, the way we get around this problem is we say, okay, God created the human character. And so evolution, material evolution creates the body, the character, the intellect, the wisdom, the soul, that's divine. And that whole idea kind of eventually fades because people realize, well, you can't have both. You got to go one way or the other. You got to either say, okay, God does everything or evolution does everything. There isn't a lot of room for overlap there. And so Wallace kind of fades from view. Whereas Darwin doesn't. And Darwin, a lot of creationists, when they're not saying Darwin was this evil, racist bastard, we're saying, well, he converted to Christianity on his deathbed. Now, the problem with that is you only convert to something that you are not. Darwin was a Christian, a believing Christian. He studied theology at Cambridge. He expected, before he knew about the opportunity to do the Beagle thing, he expected he would graduate with his divinity degree, and he would be assigned to a vicarage somewhere out in the English countryside, and he would spend a day or two preparing his sermon for Sunday, and the rest of the time he could spend wandering around collecting bugs and naturalizing, as they said. He was a very religious guy. He doesn't lose. Well, I mean, only he knows whether he lost his faith or not. You only know whether you have faith or not have faith. Nobody can really, figure that out. You're the only one who knows for sure, but only Darwin really knows what he felt. But his sort of drift away from that comes not as a reaction to his discovering natural selection. It's the death of his daughter. Annie, his oldest daughter was like his princess. He had a bunch of kids, and he loved them all, but Annie was the special one. She was the one who also loved science, and she would help him in the lab and do all that sort of stuff. A very close emotional relationship. And she gets, I think, pneumonia or something. And she dies when she's like 12 or 13, I think. Something like that. And he's just devastated. He's just heartbroken. He never really recovers from it. And that, I would argue, is what really, it's like Gilgamesh yelling at the gods when Enkidu dies. How could you kill my daughter? What possible reason would you have for taking my daughter's life? And that's the thing that really sort of pushes him away from religion, not the evolution thing. Did that answer your question anywhere in there? I start off on Wallace, I wind up with this teary moment about Darwin and his daughter. And I am a professional. Don't try this at home. I can actually link the Epic of Gilgamesh in with Darwin and his daughter and, yelling at the gods. The reason I was able to do that is because in the class, one of the class I teach at Kean on Saturday morning is Worlds of History. It's, world history for freshmen. And we just did Sumeria and the Epic of Gilgamesh, so I was in full acting mode there. Well, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Red Bank Humanists podcast. For more information, visit redbankhumanists.org or follow us on Twitter @RedBankHumanists.